So today we're fortunate to have Professor Ermin Sanatovich of Political Science Department to illuminate us on a very important area in that region, Malaysia. I personally know Malaysia only because it has perfect dining ground, so I know nothing else about that. Professor Sanatovich originally came from Bosnia and formerly known as Yugoslavia, part of Yugoslavia. And he went to school here in the United States, got his PhD in political science from Syracuse University in upstate New York. And he's been in the political science department for a few years. And his specialty is Islam.
Politics of the Muslim world.
Politics of the Muslim world, which is pretty fitting. So without further ado, Professor Sanatovich.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you again for giving me this opportunity. So I want you first to retune your accent indicators, whatever it is, kind of stretching from that part of the world English accent to a more Eastern European type English accent. So I hope by now you're calibrated your devices so we can continue. This talk is based on my dissertation research, which I did, as Professor Mao Chun mentioned, at Syracuse University in upstate New York. And I want to start by saying, if this is working, apparently it's not. Just see. Okay. By introducing Malaysia, for those of you who might not be that familiar, it's a country in Southeast Asia, as you can see here, bordering Thailand. It's part of that South China Sea basin, if you will. It also borders Indonesia and the very important straits between Malaysia and Indonesia, or the Indonesian island of Sumatra, from where a good coffee comes from, as many of you know, is Strait of Malacca here. It's very strategically important, especially for sea navigation. But that is not part of my talk today. However, I just wanted to let you know about the general geographical position of Malaysia. That is the Malaysian flag, and probably one of the first things that you can notice is that it resembles our flag here, the United States flag, right? To some extent, with just one star, but many stripes. So why this topic? Why Islamic revival in Malaysia? I think by now, talking about this in 2008, no one really needs to be convinced about the resurgence of Islam, global resurgence of Islam. I remember when I started dealing with this topic, and that was really prior to 9/11. Studying Islam and dealing with Islam wasn't really something that was considered really that interesting. It was only after 9/11, and we have these periodic events in our history when we become more interested in that part of the world. You know, 1979, the Iranian Revolution, then the 9/11. But in between, we tend to forget a lot of things. So when I started doing this topic, it wasn't that interesting. I found it interesting for many reasons. One of which was I'm in general interested in issues of political and social change, how political and social change happens. And that is one of the big topics, if you will, in comparative politics that we do. We study political change. One of the big topics is, of course, democratization. How that political change happens, transitions from one regime or political regime to another, from one type of government to another. But also we study social changes as well. And one of the big social changes that has happened in the Muslim world in the past 30 or 40 years is this Islamic revival, which is resurgence, reassertion of Islam and its teaching, not only on individual level, but also in the public and social spheres and political spheres. So these are the two main topics, big topics that really preoccupied my academic interest, if you will. That is an example, I think, that's one of the mosques in Malaysia, and it's a beautiful example of Southeast Asian Islamic architecture, if you will, because it combines elements of, you know, what is traditionally understood to be Islamic architecture, which is very Middle Eastern influence, but also a more of a Southeast Asian type of historical influences. It's a very beautiful example here that you can see. So what do we mean by Islamic revival? It is a process through which, or in which, Islam becomes important again. Now, this requires a little bit of clarification. What do you mean by Islam becoming important again? Wasn't Islam always very important in Islamic societies? Well, it was. But at the end of the 19th century and for the first part of the 20th century, Islam really took back seat. It was the time, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the fall of the traditional Islamic forms of government, and the establishment of new independent nation states. And the concepts such as nationalism took really a front seat, and not Islam, in the nation building of many of these countries. However, after having tried some of these new developments and some of these new concepts, some of the Muslim countries or people in the Muslim countries kind of felt that it wasn't really delivering, that nationalism wasn't delivering, that many of the things that they've tried in the meantime were not delivering the kind of promises that they promised in the first place, you know, the political, economic, social development, post-independence kind of development that many of these nationalistic regimes promised in the Muslim world. And so people felt that they need to reinvent their societies. And part of that is turning back to religion and trying to find what Islam says about all these things, what Islam says about development, what Islam says about politics, economics, and so on and so forth. And to the point where today, for instance, in many Muslim countries, you have a phenomenon of Islamic banking, where it's a separate issue. I don't want to go into that much, but it's basically infusing a modern banking system with some of the teachings and precepts of Islam. That's a separate topic. I don't want to go into that too much. So religion, through this process of Islamic revival, acquires a higher profile in society and politics. So I started this question of Islamic revival in Malaysia, which is a part of that global phenomenon, but also has really interesting specifics, if you will, in the Malaysian context. And Malaysia, just like many other Muslim countries, had witnessed Islamic revival, especially starting with the late 60s and through the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, where people felt that their commitment to Islam needs to be reestablished, if you will. Again, not only on individual level, but also in public sphere. That Islam has something to say about politics. Islam has something to say about the economy. Islam has something to say about society and many, many other things. And in the literature that I reviewed on Islamic revival, most of it, especially the one that was written prior to 9/11, cited these reasons as reasons for Islamic revival. So you have unemployment, you have poverty, you have misrule, which means bad governmental rule and so on, lack of opportunities, underdevelopment, and all of these things make people dissatisfied to the point that they turn back to the only really stable thing in life they know, and that is religion. There could be a kind of more philosophical critique of this that I could deliver, but we don't have time to delve into that, to relate it to theories of secularization and modernization. We don't have the time for all that. Why people felt that these were really the primary reasons for that Islamic revival. So you have this notion that the failure of modernization in Islamic societies leads to Islamic revival, and that Islamic revival is reaction to modernization. While there is something to this story, my problem with this argument is that this argument doesn't explain how this jump from, say, nationalism to Islamic revival takes place. It is assumed that it's almost automatic. If you have failure of modernization, people automatically become more Islamic, as if it's very deterministic. And in social sciences, we try to probe deeper into these processes and try to find the mechanisms how this really happens. So that's the first kind of idea. The second idea behind Islamic revival, that Islamic revival is kind of rejection of Western cultural values. And here is one of the people who had promoted this idea strongly, Bernard Lewis of Princeton University. And there's much to be said about Bernard Lewis and his philosophy being adopted, especially for the Iraq War. But that, again, is another critique, perhaps to be saved for some other time. Well, again, there is something related to rejection of Western cultural values to Islamic revival. Again, the whole phenomenon, which is really multifaceted, cannot be explained by simply saying, oh, these people reject Western cultural values and therefore they turn to Islam. Again, it's very deterministic. It looks at just one cause. It's this monocausality that attributes to the process of Islamic revival, that there is this one thing that somehow triggers these people into some sort of a safe mode where they return to religion and go back to it. There is something of it. But there is a kind of a universal critique of what is being described, especially in the works of people like Bernard Lewis, of Western cultural values. We even have people in our own society, in the United States, who criticize what is often seen as Western cultural values. More conservative, especially segments in the society, tend to have some problems with some of these values as well. So it's not something that is, again, particularly related to these Islamic societies. Again, as I said, the problems with these theories is that they are deterministic. They don't really cannot explain the jump that happens, let's say, from underdevelopment to Islamic revival. They say, well, one of the causes for Islamic revival is underdevelopment in Islamic countries. Okay, can you please describe the process that leads from underdeveloped to Islamic revival? Because if that is enough, then every country that is underdeveloped should have some sort of revival. And that argument cannot stand on the empirical grounds. And also, that would also assume that countries that exhibit good economic and political development will not have an Islamic revival. And I have chosen Malaysian case precisely for one of the reasons, is because it shows a case where Islamic revival and economic development actually went hand in hand. Other solutions were actually implemented and tried. It's not that just people jump directly from, say, underdevelopment to Islamic revival. They had underdevelopment in the 1920s, 1930s. They tried nationalism. They tried other ideas, liberalism. Egypt was actually, in terms of social thought, was very liberal in 1920s, 1930s. It didn't have a liberal government because it didn't have a government of its own at that time. I just saw a book being published actually on liberal thought in Egypt, 1920s, 1930s. Liberal ideas were circulated in those countries. And at some points have even been tried, especially those that are more related to nationalism. And nationalism and liberalism are not mutually exclusive, as I'm sure many of you know. So again, there is no automatic jump from underdeveloped to Islamic revival. There must be something else going on. And that something else, as I'm trying to argue, is that Islamic revival is best explained by using ideational logic of explanation. And I will explain just a little bit what that means. That is, Islamic revival, I'm using here abbreviation, and people in international relations would feel that this is sacrilege as I'm using IR for Islamic revival, is the product of certain ideas and teachings derived from Islamic religion by Muslim revivalists who carry these ideas. And I will qualify this argument a little bit later to explain what I mean by this. I mean, you could say, yeah, ideas matter, ideas are appropriated by people, but you would be actually perhaps surprised to learn that in political science, and much of political science, at least until recently, ideas didn't really matter that much. We studied institutions, right? We study many other structural theories. But ideas, until recently, were not admitted into the mainstream of political science, until fairly recently. I mean, you have this new institutionalism and kind of jump to the what I call ideational logic of explanation in comparative politics. But of course, ideas are always there. How ideas are being propagated and appropriated and disseminated, diffused and accepted is really what matters. And this is really the meat of my argument, if you will, that I will talk about in a while. So the case of Malaysia, for one, it illustrates the global nature of Islamic revival. And also is an interesting example where Islamic revival and economic development went hand in hand. The people who produced Islamic revival and were the, if you will, the torch carriers of Islamic revival were not the poor, uneducated people, were actually among the most educated people in their societies. And that goes against this whole idea of how this some sort of underdevelopment and poverty and all that causes or is used to best explain the Islamic revival. In my approach, especially from a theoretical perspective, I use several aspects of both comparative politics and international relations theories. From comparative politics, I use what I call ideational logic of explanation, and unfortunately, I don't have much time to go into that. But basically, it's this idea that ideas matter and that ideas can have their own causal logic, which then in the literature that talks about these issues is explained and what is meant by that. And I don't want to go too much into that. First of all, this is not a dissertation defense, and it's not a job talk. I don't have to be that theoretically smart to deliver this talk. So I'm going to skip on that. That's usually the part of the talk that matters only to really a few people. But if you have questions later on, I would be more than willing and happy to explain that. From the international relations theory, I have used the constructivist approach, which is basically about norms and ideas, that norms and ideas and beliefs matter, and how these inform behavior, say, of political actors. And they're used especially in international relations, but they could be used, I think, also in comparative politics. And I also use social movement theories, and especially within the social movement theories, the part of the social movement theories that talk about the framing processes. Now, what are these framing? Framing, socialization, mobilization. What are the framing processes? The framing process is basically how any political actor frames their ideas, how they frame any given issue. And we will see in the Malaysian case that the way in which the Malaysian Islamic revivalists framed their ideas really mattered. And it's really what made people to respond to those ideas. So framing in social movement theory is extremely, extremely important. Doesn't have anything to do with pictures or anything like that. It's not that type of framing. So in my argument, I trace the sources, the evolution, acceptance, and dissemination of these ideas to show a logical kind of process, how these ideas are being created, if you will, by these idea entrepreneurs, if I could use that term, and then how they are disseminated and why they are accepted. And if I'm able to explain that, and I obviously think that I am, then I would have, give a good account of how this whole process happens. So let's see how well I did with this. So I'm focusing, when I say ideas, I'm focusing on what I call middle range of programmatic ideas. If you think of ideas, you can have a very specific idea, such as policy. Let's say someone's stance on abortion is an idea, a very specific kind of policy-oriented idea. Or you could have, on the other hand, other side of the spectrum, you could have political ideologies, this kind of grained claim set of ideas that cohere together, cohesive, explain political beliefs and values. In between those, there are certain ideas that might assume some characteristic, might propose certain specific policies, but are at the same time based on certain philosophical generalizations, such as like ideologies are. And these kind of middle range ideas are really what I'm concerned about. They can be used to prescribe certain policies, but they are not really themselves political ideologies. So I call these ideas middle range programmatic ideas. They influence specific policies, and they also determine the range of possible actions. And I also look at the ideas diffusion. If I am to say, look, there are certain ideas that certain people proposed in order to create what later on came to be known as Islamic revival, I have also to account for the process of how they were able to spread those ideas among many other people. And that's what we mean by ideas diffusion. So I look also at socialization, at framing processes, as I have already mentioned, at social learning, and at norm localization. This norm localization is extremely important. Why am I saying that? Well, in order to sell an idea to someone, you have to tell them why that idea is important in their own local context. So if these Malaysian revivalists were to sell the idea of Islamic revival, some of which is acquired from other Islamic thinkers outside Malaysia, they have to be able to explain to people in Malaysia, to the Muslims in Malaysia, because that is their audience, why these ideas are important in their own context. This is where norm localization takes place. If there is no such component in their explanation, in their effort to spread these ideas will not spread. This actually is so important. It goes back to issues of promoting democracy in whatever country you want to talk about. Without normal localization, forget about it. Forget about it. So it's extremely, extremely important. Okay, so what are some of these ideas of Islamic revival? Well, these are some idea entrepreneurs, if you will. None of these three persons that I mentioned here are Malaysians. The first person is Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brothers in Egypt. You have Muhammad Iqbal, who was a famous Indian philosopher, poet, writer, Islamic scholar, if you will. And you also have Maududi, who was the founder of the Jamaat Islami, the famous Pakistani Islamic movement. What were these ideas that these people propagated and were later adopted by Malaysian Islamic revivalists and then localized for the Malaysian audience, if you will? Well, the two main ideas on which perhaps every effort at revival and reform in the Muslim world in the past 14 centuries was framed, within which. But again, it had to be localized and contextualized for whatever time and place it was implemented in. The first such idea is the idea of renewal, known as tajdeed in Arabic language. What is this tajdeed? Well, this tajdeed, the idea of renewal, is actually based on a prophetic saying where in Islamic sources it is said that the Prophet Muhammad said that God will send to this community, meaning to the Muslim community, on top of every 100 years, a person who will renew their religion for them. So there is an inbuilt kind of assumption in Islam that the community will over time kind of waver or falter in their adherence to Islam, and that from time to time there will be people, not prophets, because prophets according to Islamic religion have stopped with the Prophet Muhammad, but kind of people who are kind of more ethically and morally aware of the situation and the needs of their society, who would then go and propagate what this tradition at least proposes is kind of authentic type of Islam. And this notion of authenticity is a big part of the revivalist discourse. The second part of this proposal for reform and revival is the notion of reform itself, which in Islam is known as Islah. It is a word that was being mentioned in the Quran, it was mentioned in the prophetic traditions, it was mentioned in Islamic sources. And by reform, and here is something that I want you to understand, they don't mean the type of reform like we had in the West, like Reformation. By reform, they mean bringing society to the proper practice of religion as envisioned by these revivalists. It's not reforming religion to conform with what society wants. It's actually looking at the society, finding what's wrong with it, and bringing it back to religion. That is the understanding of Islamic revival and reform that really was generic understanding of every attempt that happened many times in Muslim history, including this contemporary part. But the new idea that these people brought, in addition to these two ideas that were present, which they also kind of contextualized for the time that they lived in, is the idea of Islam as a comprehensive way of life. What they call Islam as ad-din. Ad-din is a word religion in Arabic, but really it means much more than that. It means what we would loosely translate in contemporary English as way of life. Basically saying, look, if Islam is the way of life, that is their assumption, then Islam has something to say not only about spirituality and your relationship with your Creator and your salvation in the hereafter, but it also has something to say about politics. It also has something to say about the way you arrange your family relations, your social relations, your political relations, your economic relations. Islam has to say a little bit about each of these aspects of life. And that is where they bring this notion of Islam as an ideology. Basically, it's an all-encompassing ideology that really, really permeates every aspect of human activity. So these are the people that brought these ideas internationally. In the Malaysian context, the Malaysian Islamic revivalists really started their operations, if you will, in the 1960s. Some of it was indigenous to Malaysia. Obviously, Malaysia had a tradition of Islamic learning and scholarship from before, but also much of it was acquired from many of these writers like Hassan al-Banna Maududi, Sayyid Qutb, Muhammad Iqbal, and many other Islamic leaders. So you have this kind of domestic Malaysian scholars, and you also have the Indonesian link. Malaysia is in proximity to Indonesia, which, as I'm sure most of you know, is the most populous Muslim country in the world. It has a long tradition of Islamic learning. And Malaysia and Indonesia, because of their culture, language, and history, have strong historical links. And so the Indonesian link was also very important here. Some of the Indonesian scholars' ideas were adapted into Malaysian revivalist discourse. In addition to that, the Malay students abroad who studied overseas also used to bring some of these ideas. Interestingly enough, many of these did not study in what we call the Muslim world or the Middle East or so on. Many of them actually studied in the West, and especially the UK, but also in the United States, where they came in touch with other Muslim revivalists from Egypt, from Syria, from other parts of the Muslim world. And it was actually for the first time that many Malay scholars and students came in touch with these revivalist ideas. And so they acquired these ideas from other Muslims in the UK and the US, Muslims who came to study also in these countries. And then after completing their course of study, would go back to Malaysia and propagate these ideas. So you see how this is indeed a transnational effort, a transnational, if you will, phenomenon. You cannot understand Malaysian Islamic revival without understanding the transnational component of it. Usually in my classes, and I know that the midshipmen don't get enough sleep, or perhaps they give you some kind of injection when you join the Naval Academy where they make you feel asleep during certain periods, I ask my students to stand up for a kind of maybe 10, 20 seconds. So would you do me that favor and do that here? It's also good for your blood circulation, by the way.
That means half time.
Okay, well, I can see everyone is in much better mood right now, so you can sit down and let me put you back to sleep again.
We're revived.
In addition to these moments that I've already explained, these theoretical approaches, there is also a very important moment in explaining Islamic revival, any kind of social